It was a quiet Tuesday morning on Interstate 80, the kind of day where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Cars and trucks zipped past each other in a steady rhythm, their drivers focused on reaching their destinations. Among them was Carl, a middle-aged truck driver who had spent more than 20 years hauling freight across state lines. He knew the highways like the back of his hand, every rest, stop, every diner and every stretch of road that required extra caution. Carl wasn't flashy or loud. He was the kind of guy who preferred to stay in the background, quietly doing his job without seeking attention. But he took immense pride in what he did. To him, being a truck driver wasn't just about moving goods from one place to another, it was about keeping the country running. Without people like him, shelves would go empty, hospitals would lack supplies, and families wouldn't have food on their tables. That thought gave him a sense of purpose, even on the toughest days. On this particular morning, Carl was hauling a load of electronics destined for a warehouse in Chicago. The drive had been uneventful so far, the kind of trip where you could let your mind wander as the miles rolled by. He sipped his coffee from a thermos, listening to an old country song playing softly on the radio. His rig hummed beneath him, a familiar sound that felt almost comforting after all these years. As he cruised along, something unusual caught his eye. A sleek black SUV pulled over to the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. At first glance, it looked like any other breakdown, but something about it made Carl slow down. Maybe it was the way the vehicle sat perfectly still against the backdrop of speeding cars. Or maybe it was the figure standing beside it, looking slightly frustrated but calm. Whatever it was, Carl's instincts kicked in. Pulling up behind the SUV, he put on his hazard lights and stepped out of his truck. The cool autumn breeze greeted him as he adjusted his cap and walked toward the stranded vehicle. Up close, he could see that the rear tire was completely flat. A man stood nearby wearing a simple leather jacket and jeans. He didn't look like someone who was used to dealing with car troubles. There was no toolbox in sight, no attempt to fix the tire himself. Instead, he leaned against the SUV, arms crossed, watching the traffic whiz by. "Looks like you've got yourself a flat," Carl said cheerfully, pointing at the deflated tire. The man turned to face him, offering a polite smile. "Yeah, seems like it. I'm not exactly handy with this sort of thing." "No problem," Carl replied confidently. "I'll have it changed in no time." Without waiting for further discussion, Carl opened the back of his rig and retrieved his toolkit. He'd helped plenty of stranded motorists before, and fixing a tire was second nature to him. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how unassuming the man was. There was nothing flashy about him. No expensive watch, no designer shoes, just a plain leather jacket and a pair of well-worn jeans. Yet there was something oddly familiar about him, though Carl couldn't quite put his finger on it. "So, what brings you out here?" Carl asked casually as he loosened the lug nuts. Small talk came naturally to him, especially when he was working. It made the time pass quicker and often led to interesting conversations. "I was at a business meeting," the man replied. "Just heading back home now." Sounds fancy," Carl joked, glancing up briefly. "Not too many people driving around in a ride like this one." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not mine, actually. It belongs to a friend. I borrowed it for the trip." "Well, whoever owns it must trust you a lot," Carl remarked, returning his focus to the tire. "This is some high-end stuff right here." For a moment, the man didn't respond. When Carl glanced up again, he noticed a faint smile playing on the stranger's lips, as if he found humor in the comment, but wasn't going to elaborate. Something about the man's demeanor intrigued Carl. Despite the inconvenience of the flat tire, he seemed remarkably composed, almost serene. Most people would be fuming or pacing anxiously, but not this guy. He radiated a quiet confidence that was hard to ignore. As Carl continued working, he kept sneaking peeks at the man's face. There was definitely something familiar about him, though Carl couldn't pinpoint why. Was it the eyes? The way he carried himself? Or maybe it was just wishful thinking. After all, celebrities didn't usually end up stranded on highways, did they? Once the tire was securely replaced, Carl stood back, wiping his hands on a rag. "All set," he announced proudly. "You should be good to go now." The man extended a hand, gratitude evident in his expression. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it." Carl waved off the thanks. "Just doing my part. Safe travels." But before the man could climb back into the SUV, he paused, turning toward Carl with a curious glint in his eye. "Hey, do you mind if we grab some coffee? There's a diner just down the road. I'd love to hear more about your life on the road." Carl hesitated briefly. He hadn't planned on taking a break, but there was something genuine about the man's demeanor that put him at ease. "Sure, why not?" he agreed with a shrug. Little did Carl know, accepting that invitation would lead to one of the most memorable hours of his life, an hour that would remind him of the power of kindness, connection, and the unexpected ways life can surprise you. The diner wasn't far, just a short drive down the road, and it was exactly the kind of place Carl felt comfortable in. It was a classic American greasy spoon, the kind that hadn't changed much over the decades. The sign outside flickered, faintly, and the parking lot was filled with a mix of trucks, sedans, and motorcycles. Inside, the air smelled of fried food and freshly brewed coffee. Vinyl booths lined the walls, and a jukebox in the corner played an old country tune. It was simple, unpretentious, and familiar, a perfect reflection of Carl's world. As they walked in, Carl held the door open for the stranger, who nodded appreciatively before stepping inside. They chose a booth near the window, where sunlight streamed through slightly smudged glass, casting warm golden patterns on the table. A waitress approached almost immediately, her pen poised over a notepad. "What can I get you to?" she asked with a smile. "Just coffee for me," Carl said, sliding into the seat. He didn't need to look at the menu. He'd had breakfast at diners like this hundreds of times before. The stranger across from him gave a small nod. "Same here, thanks." Once the waitress left, Carl leaned back in his seat, resting his hands on the table. "So what's your name again?" he asked, realizing he hadn't actually heard it during their earlier exchange. "John," the man replied simply, extending a hand across the table. "And you're Carl, right?" "That's me," Carl confirmed, shaking John's hand firmly. There was something about the way John carried himself, calm, measured, that made Carl feel oddly at ease. It was as if he had all the time in the world, no rush, no stress. Most people would have been eager to get back on the road after a flat tire, but not John. He seemed content to linger, to listen. The waitress returned with their coffees, setting them down with a clink of ceramic against formica. Steam curled upward from the mugs carrying the rich aroma of roasted beans. Carl took a sip, savoring the warmth as it spread through him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, though. It was companionable, the kind that comes when two people are comfortable enough to just be. Finally, John broke the quiet. "You've been driving trucks for a long time, haven't you?" Carl nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Yeah, more than 20 years now. Started out hauling produce, then moved on to electronics, furniture, you name it. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills." "It's more than that," John said thoughtfully, his gaze steady. "Without truck drivers like you, everything falls apart. No groceries in stores, no supplies in hospitals, no packages arriving on time. You're keeping the whole system running." Carl blinked, surprised by the sincerity in John's voice. Most people didn't think twice about truck drivers unless their Amazon order was late or they saw a rig blocking traffic. To hear someone acknowledge the importance of his job, not just tolerate it but genuinely appreciate it, was unexpected. "Well, I don't know about all that," he muttered modestly, scratching the back of his neck. "I just do my part, you know, keep the wheels turning." John smiled faintly, leaning forward slightly. "That's exactly why it matters. People take it for granted, but without guys like you, the world stops. Literally." Carl chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound like I'm saving lives or something." "In a way you are," John countered, his tone light but serious. "Think about it. Every hospital needs medicine, every family needs food. If those things don't show up, bad things happen. And who gets them there? Truck drivers. For a moment, Carl didn't know how to respond. He'd always known his job was important, of course, but hearing it framed in such a meaningful way made him pause. Maybe it wasn't just about paying the bills or clocking in hours. Maybe it really did mean something bigger. Changing the subject slightly, John gestured toward Carl's rig, which was visible through the window. How do you handle it? All those hours on the road away from home? Carl shrugged, taking another sip of coffee. It's not easy. I'll admit that. Missing birthdays, holidays, family dinners, it adds up. But you learn to adapt. Plus, there's a certain freedom to it, you know. Being out here, seeing different parts of the country, meeting people. Every day is different. Some days are tough, sure, but others... He trailed off, searching for the right words. Others remind you why you started in the first place. John nodded slowly, as if absorbing Carl's words. Do you ever get lonely? Sometimes, Carl admitted, but you find ways to cope. Music helps, audiobooks too. And then there are moments like this, random acts of kindness, conversations with strangers. They keep you grounded, remind you that the world isn't as disconnected as it sometimes feels. The waitress stopped by again, refilling their cups without interrupting the flow of their conversation. Outside, cars passed by on the highway, oblivious to the quiet exchange happening within the diner's walls. After a while, John leaned back in his seat, studying Carl with an expression that was hard to read. You know, most people wouldn't stop to help a stranger on the side of the road. They'd assume someone else will take care of it, or they'd be too busy to bother. But you didn't hesitate. Why is that? Carl frowned, caught off guard by the question. I guess... I don't. No, it's just the right thing to do, isn't it? You see someone in need, you help them. Doesn't matter who they are or where they're from, we're all just trying to get through life, aren't we? John's eyes softened, and he gave a small nod. Exactly. That's what makes people like you special, Carl. You don't overthink it. You just act, with kindness, with compassion. Not everyone does that anymore. There was a weight to John's words, a depth that went beyond casual conversation. Carl found himself sitting, a little straighter, feeling a strange mix of pride and humility. He wasn't used to being complimented so openly, especially by someone who seemed so thoughtful and genuine. As they continued talking, Carl noticed something curious. The longer they sat there, the more he realized how intently John listened. Not just to his words, but to the emotions behind them. It was as if John truly cared about understanding Carl's perspective, his experiences, his struggles. Most people only skim the surface in conversations like this, but John dove deeper, asking follow-up questions and offering insights that made Carl feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. By the time their coffee cups were empty, Carl felt a sense of connection he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a random encounter anymore. It was something more, something meaningful. Little did Carl know, the surprises weren't over yet. In fact, they were only beginning. As Carl and John stepped out of the diner, the crisp autumn air greeted them once again. The parking lot was quieter now, with only a few cars scattered around. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Carl stretched his arms, feeling a mix of satisfaction and curiosity. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had such an engaging conversation with a complete stranger. There was something about John, his calm demeanor, his thoughtful questions that made Carl feel like they'd known each other for years. Well, I guess this is where we part ways, Carl said, glancing toward his rig parked a few spaces away. Thanks for the coffee chat, it was, nice. John nodded, his hands tucked into the pockets of his leather jacket. It was more than nice, Carl. You've given me a lot to think about. For a moment, neither of them moved. John stood there studying Carl with an intensity that felt almost reverent. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it made Carl shift his weight from one foot to the other. What? He asked finally, half smiling. Do I have something on my face? John chuckled softly, shaking his head. No, nothing like that. I just appreciate meeting people like you. People who remind me what's important in life. Carl shrugged. brushing off the compliment. I'm just doing my job, same as everyone else. Not everyone sees it that way, John replied quietly. Then, after a pause, he added, Hey, do you mind if I walk you to your truck? I want to make sure everything's okay with the tire before I head out. Carl hesitated briefly. Most folks would have been eager to get back on the road after fixing a flat, but John seemed genuinely interested in making sure everything was in order. Sure, why not? He agreed, leading the way. They walked side by side, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. When they reached Carl's rig, John knelt down to inspect the newly replaced tire. He ran his fingers along the edge, checking for any signs of damage or unevenness. Satisfied, he stood up and gave Carl a thumbs up. Looks good. You did a great job. Of course I did, Carl joked, puffing out his chest playfully. You're talking to the best tire changer east of the Mississippi. John laughed, a genuine hearty laugh that made Carl grin too. But then, as they stood there, something changed. A group of truckers exiting the diner nearby slowed down, their eyes widening as they spotted John. One of them whispered loudly enough for Carl to hear, Is that Keanu Reeves? Carl froze, staring at John, or rather Keanu, with disbelief. Memories came flooding back. Movie posters, action-packed scenes, interviews where those dark, soulful eyes stared into the camera. How had he missed it earlier? Sure, Keanu looked different without the Hollywood glamour. No flashy suit, no entourage, but it was unmistakably him. You're kidding me, Carl muttered, running a hand over his face. All this time, I thought you were just some guy named John. Keanu smiled sheepishly, clearly accustomed to these kinds of reactions. Sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I didn't want it to be weird. Weird? Carl repeated, still trying to process what was happening. Man, I fixed your tire without even realizing. He trailed off, letting out a low whistle. This has got to be the craziest thing that's ever happened to me. Keanu chuckled, looking slightly embarrassed. I promise I'm not messing with you. I really do travel like this sometimes, low-key, no fanfare. It's easier that way. Carl shook his head, unable to stop smiling. I can't believe it. Here I was thinking I was helping some random businessman, and it turns out I'm talking to, well, you. Keanu's expression softened. Does it change anything? I mean, does knowing who I am make a difference? Carl thought about it for a moment. Did it? On one level, yes. It was surreal to realize he'd been sitting across from one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, sharing stories about life on the road. But on another level, no. Whether Keanu was famous or not, he was still the same kind, humble person Carl had enjoyed talking to over coffee. Fame didn't erase the fact that they'd connected as human beings. No, Carl said finally, meeting Keanu's gaze. It doesn't change a thing. You're still the guy whose tire I fixed, and the guy who reminded me why my job matters. Keanu smiled warmly, clearly touched by Carl's words. That means a lot, Carl. Really. For a moment they stood there in silence, the reality of the situation sinking in. Then Keanu reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Here, he said, handing it to Carl. Something to remember this day by. Curious, Carl unfolded the paper to reveal a signed photograph of Keanu. Beneath the autograph was a handwritten message. To Carl, a true hero on the road. Thank you for reminding me what kindness looks like. Carl stared at the photo, his throat tightening unexpectedly. Wow, he murmured, looking up at Keanu. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Keanu replied gently. Just keep doing what you're doing, Carl. Keep being you. That's more than enough. Before Carl could respond, Keanu turned toward his SUV, which was parked a few spaces away. As he climbed inside, he rolled down the window and called, Out, take care of yourself, Carl, and keep doing what you're doing. You make the world better every day. With that, Keanu drove off, leaving Carl standing beside his rig, clutching the signed photo and grinning like an idiot. For several minutes he didn't move, replaying the events of the past hour in his mind. What were the odds? Out of all the people on the highway, he'd stopped to help Keanu Reeves. and ended up having one of the most meaningful conversations of his life. Back on the road, Carl couldn't stop smiling. His initial shock had faded, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. In the span of an hour, a routine act of kindness had transformed into an unforgettable encounter with one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. But what stayed with him most wasn't the autograph or the celebrity status. It was the reminder that even the smallest gestures could leave a lasting impact. Over the next few days, Carl found himself reflecting on their conversation. Keanu's words about the importance of truck drivers resonated deeply. He realized how easy it was to lose sight of the bigger picture when you were stuck in the monotony of daily life. But Keanu had reminded him that his work mattered, not just to him, but to countless others who depended on it. Each time Carl passed another driver on the highway, he waved a little more enthusiastically. Each handshake with a fellow trucker felt a bit firmer, a bit warmer. And whenever doubt crept in, he glanced at the framed photo hanging above his dashboard, a constant testament to the power of connection and humility. Sometimes, life throws unexpected detours your way. For Carl, that detour led straight to Keanu Reeves and ultimately back to himself. As Carl climbed back into his rig, he couldn't help but glance at the signed photograph sitting on the passenger seat. The words scrawled beneath Keanu's signature were simple, yet they carried a weight that made Carl pause. A true hero. On the road. He chuckled to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. Him? A hero? Sure, he helped people when he could, changing tires, giving directions, sharing snacks with stranded motorists. But he never thought of himself as anything special, just a guy doing his job. Still, those words lingered in his mind as he started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. The sun was higher now, casting a bright light over the endless stretch of asphalt ahead. Cars zipped past him, their drivers oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside Carl's head. For years, he'd felt invisible, like just another cog in the machine. But today, for the first time in a long while, he felt seen. Not because of who Keanu Reeves was, but because of how Keanu had treated him, with genuine respect and appreciation. The miles rolled by, and Carl found himself replaying their conversation over and over again. He thought about how Keanu had listened, not just nodded politely, but truly listened, as if every word Carl said mattered. Most people only skimmed the surface during small talk, but Keanu had gone deeper. He'd asked questions that made Carl reflect on his own life, his choices, his purpose. It wasn't often someone took the time to understand what it meant to be a truck driver, to see beyond the stereotype of the gruff, lonely guy behind the wheel. Carl's thoughts drifted to his family. His wife, Linda, always joked that she was married to the road more than to him. His kids, now grown and living their own lives, barely remembered what it was like to have him around for holidays or birthdays. He loved them fiercely, but the demands of his job often kept him away. Over the years, he'd convinced himself that missing out was part of the deal, that the sacrifices he made were worth it because he was providing for them. But after talking to Keanu, he began to wonder if there was more to it than that. Maybe being a truck driver wasn't just about delivering goods or earning a paycheck. Maybe it was about connection, the connections you made along the way, even if they were fleeting. Like the waitress at the diner who refilled their coffee cups without interrupting their conversation. Or the group of truckers who recognized Keanu but didn't crowd around or ask for selfies. They simply nodded respectfully before heading to their rigs. These moments, though small, added up to something bigger. They reminded Carl that no matter how isolated he sometimes felt, he was still part of a community. By mid-afternoon, Carl reached a rest stop nestled between rolling hills dotted with trees painted in shades of red and gold. It was one of his favorite spots, a quiet place where he could stretch his legs, grab a bite to eat, and clear his head. As he parked his rig and stepped outside, he noticed a young couple standing near their car, looking frustrated. The hood was popped, and steam rose from the engine in thin wisps. Without hesitation, Carl walked over. "Looks like you're having some trouble," he said, already reaching for his toolkit. The man looked up, relief washing over his face. "Yeah, We've been stuck here for almost an hour. We don't know much about cars. No worries, Carl replied with a reassuring smile. Let me take a look. As he worked, memories of his encounter with Keanu replayed in his mind. He realized now why Keanu had seemed so familiar earlier. It wasn't just his face. It was his attitude. Humble, approachable, kind. Those qualities weren't unique to celebrities. Anyone could embody them. And maybe, just maybe, Carl could too. After fixing the couple's radiator hose, he waved off their thanks and climbed back into his truck. Sitting there, he unfolded Keanu's note once more, reading the message aloud under his breath. Thank you for reminding me what kindness looks like. He smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Kindness. That was something everyone could give, regardless of their circumstances. Later that evening, as dusk settled, over the horizon, Carl pulled into a truck stop bustling with activity. Trucks lined up row after row, their engines idling softly. Inside the main building, drivers lounged in chairs, chatting or scrolling through their phones. The air smelled of diesel fuel, mixed with the faint aroma of fast food. It was a scene Carl knew well, one he'd experienced countless times before. But tonight it felt different. He grabbed a sandwich from the vending area and sat down at a table near the window. Across from him, two younger truckers were deep in conversation. One of them complained bitterly about the long hours and low pay, while the other nodded sympathetically. Carl watched them for a moment, remembering when he'd felt the same way. Back then he'd let bitterness creep in, convincing himself that the world owed him something for all his hard work. But sitting here now, he saw things differently. Finishing his sandwich, Carl leaned forward slightly. Mind if I join your chat? He asked, gesturing toward the empty chair beside them. The younger men glanced at each other, then shrugged. Sure, go ahead, one of them said. For the next hour, Carl shared stories from his years on the road, tales of close calls, quirky roadside encounters, and lessons learned. He talked about the importance of finding joy in the little things, whether it was a perfect cup of coffee or a sunset viewed from the driver's seat. He spoke about how helping others, even in small ways, could make the world feel a little less lonely. And finally, he told them about meeting Keanu Reeves, not to brag, but to illustrate a point. You ever notice how sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can mean the most? Carl asked, leaning back in his chair. Fixing a tire, sharing a meal, listening to someone's story. It doesn't take much, but it makes a difference. The younger truckers exchanged glances, clearly intrigued. That's pretty cool, one of them admitted. I guess I never really thought about it like that. Carl smiled, standing up to leave. Just something to keep in mind. We're all out here doing our thing, but we don't have to do it alone. Sometimes it's the connections we make that get us through. As he walked back to his rig, Carl felt lighter somehow. The weight of the day's events, the unexpected encounter, the reflections, the conversations, had shifted something inside him. He realized now that being a truck driver wasn't just about moving goods from point A to point B. It was about moving people too, lifting spirits, sparking hope, creating moments that lingered long after the journey ended. When Carl finally settled into his bunk that night, he stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events one last time. Meeting Keanu Reeves had been extraordinary, yes, but it was the ordinary moments, the ones he hadn't paid much attention to before, that truly stood out. Helping strangers, sharing stories, offering encouragement. It was these acts, however, small, that reminded him why he chose this life in the first place. And as sleep claimed him, Carl drifted off with a smile, knowing that tomorrow would bring new roads, new challenges, and perhaps even new opportunities to make a difference. After all, every mile held the promise of connection, and connection, he realized, was what made the journey worthwhile. The next morning, Carl woke up before sunrise, the faint glow of dawn seeping through the curtains of his sleeper cab. He stretched, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The events of the previous day, the flat tire, the diner conversation, the revelation about Keanu Reeves, felt like they had happened in another lifetime. Yet their impact lingered, shaping the way Carl viewed not just his job but himself. As he brewed a fresh pot of coffee in his rig's small kitchenette, Carl found himself humming an old tune. It wasn't something he did often. Usually mornings were quiet and routine, a time to prepare for another long day on the road. But today felt different. Today he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, one that made even the mundane tasks feel meaningful. By the time he hit the highway, the world around him was waking up. Trucks rumbled past, their engines roaring like distant thunder. Fields stretched endlessly on either side, golden waves of wheat swaying gently in the breeze. Carl adjusted his cap, sipping his coffee as he settled into the rhythm of the drive. For the first time in a long while, he didn't turn on the radio or reach for an audiobook. Instead, he let his thoughts wander, reflecting on the lessons he'd taken from his encounter with Keanu. One thing stuck out more than anything else: the idea that kindness mattered, not grand gestures, but the everyday acts of compassion that most people overlooked. Fixing a tire, sharing a meal, lending an ear. All these things added up to something bigger. They reminded people they weren't alone, that someone cared enough to stop, to listen, to help. And in a world that often felt disconnected, those moments could be life-changing. Carl's musings were interrupted when he noticed a car pulled over on the shoulder ahead. Its hood was popped, steam rising in thin plumes. Without hesitation, he signaled and pulled over behind it. As he stepped out of his rig, he spotted a young woman pacing nervously beside the vehicle, her phone pressed to her ear. She looked up as Carl approached, relief washing over her face. "Everything okay?" Carl asked, already grabbing his toolkit from the back of his truck. "I think the engine overheated," she said, lowering her phone. "I don't know much about cars, and I'm supposed to be at work soon." Her voice trailed off, tinged with frustration. "No problem," Carl replied with a reassuring smile. "Let me take a look." Kneeling by the engine, Carl quickly identified the issue: a busted radiator hose. It was a common problem, one he'd seen dozens of times before. Within minutes, he had the replacement part installed and the engine running smoothly again. The woman thanked him profusely, offering to pay him for his trouble, but Carl waved her off. "Just doing my part," he said simply. "Safe travels." As he climbed back into his rig, Carl caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror. There was a hint of pride in his expression, though it wasn't the kind that came from being recognized or praised. It was quieter, deeper, a satisfaction born from knowing he'd made someone's day a little easier. Later that afternoon, Carl decided to take a detour. His route allowed for some flexibility, and he wanted to visit a small roadside diner he remembered fondly from years ago. It wasn't fancy, just a cozy place with checkered tablecloths and a menu full of comfort. Food, but it held a special spot in his heart. He'd spent many evenings there during layovers, chatting with the owner and swapping stories with fellow truckers. When he walked in, the familiar scent of fried chicken and pie greeted him. The owner, a stout woman named Betty, looked up from behind the counter and broke into a wide grin. "Carl, haven't seen you in ages." "Been busy," Carl replied, sliding onto a stool. "How's business?" "Same as always," Betty said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "You still ordering?" "The usual?" "You know me too well." Carl chuckled, watching as she placed a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes in front of him. As he ate, Carl struck up conversations with other patrons, some regulars, others passing through. One man, a farmer hauling livestock, complained about rising fuel prices. Another, a traveling salesman, shared tales of quirky hotel stays. Carl listened intently, nodding along and offering advice where he could. These interactions might have seemed insignificant to outsiders, but to Carl they were reminders of the connections that defined his life on the road. At one point, Betty leaned against the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You seem different today, Carl," she remarked thoughtfully. "What's got you smiling so much?" Carl hesitated, unsure how to explain. How could he put into words the strange mix of emotions he'd been carrying since meeting Keanu? Finally, he shrugged. Guess I'm just appreciating the little things more. You know, the people we meet, the stories we share, it all adds up. Betty smiled knowingly. Well, whatever it is, keep it up. We need more folks like you around here. That evening, as Carl drove toward Chicago, he reflected on Betty's words. Appreciating the little things. That was the key, wasn't? Kirsian life on the road wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy. Long hours, missed holidays, endless stretches of solitude. Those were the realities of his job. But woven into those challenges were moments of beauty, connection, and meaning. Moments that, if you paid attention, could fill your days with light. He thought about Keanu again, not as a celebrity, but as a person who had taken the time to see him, to acknowledge the value of what he did. That acknowledgement had sparked something in Carl, a realization that his work wasn't just about moving goods. It was about touching lives, even in small ways. Every handshake, every wave, every smile exchanged with another driver. They all mattered. Together, they formed a tapestry of humanity that spanned across highways and borders. Reaching for the framed photograph on the passenger seat, Carl glanced at it briefly before tucking it away. He didn't need to look at it anymore. Its message was etched in his mind. A true hero on the road. Those words weren't just for him. They were for everyone who chose to show up, to do their best, to make a difference. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle above, Carl felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, for the people he'd met, and for the reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, affecting lives in ways he might never fully understand. And as he merged onto the interstate, headlights, cutting through the darkness, Carl knew one thing for certain. The road ahead would always hold challenges, but it would also hold opportunities. To connect, to inspire, to leave a mark. All he had to do was keep driving forward, 1 mile at a time. By the time Carl reached Chicago, the city skyline loomed in the distance, its towering buildings bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The highway buzzed with activity, cars honking, trucks rumbling, and the occasional siren wailing in the background. It was a stark contrast to the quiet stretches of open road he'd grown accustomed to over the past few days. Yet, even amidst the chaos, Carl felt a sense of calm. He wasn't just delivering cargo anymore. He was carrying something far more valuable, a renewed perspective. Pulling into the warehouse lot, Carl parked his rig and stepped out, stretching, his legs after the long drive. The air smelled faintly of diesel and concrete, a familiar scent that reminded him of countless other deliveries. But tonight, as he handed over the paperwork to the dock manager, he found himself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile that caught the manager off guard. "You look happy," the manager remarked, raising an eyebrow. "Just a good day," Carly replied, shrugging casually. He didn't elaborate. Some things didn't need explaining. Instead, he climbed back into his truck, ready to head to a nearby motel for the night. Tomorrow would bring a new load, a new destination, and likely new encounters along the way. For now, though, he wanted to savor the moment, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd made a difference, however small. The next morning, Carl woke early, eager to start the return trip home. This time, instead of feeling weighed down by the miles ahead, he embraced them. Every turn of the wheel brought fresh possibilities, a stranger in need, a fellow driver looking for advice, or simply someone who needed a friendly wave. These moments, fleeting as they might be, were what gave life on the road its meaning. As he drove, Carl noticed a weathered sign advertising a roadside park a few exits away. On impulse, he decided to take a break. The park was nestled among tall trees, their leaves turning vibrant shades of orange and red. A narrow path wound through the woods, leading to a small clearing where a bench overlooked a peaceful pond. Carl stepped out of his rig, breathing in the crisp autumn air. It was quiet here, almost eerily so, but in a way that felt restorative rather than lonely. Sitting on the bench, Carl let his mind wander. He thought about Keanu again, not the actor, but the man who had taken the time to share coffee and conversation. with him. That brief encounter had planted a seed, one that had grown into a deeper understanding of his own role in the world. Truck drivers weren't just cogs in a machine. They were connectors, lifelines, bridges between communities. And Carl? He was proud to be part of that chain. A rustling sound nearby pulled him from his thoughts. Turning, he spotted a young boy, standing at the edge of the clearing, clutching a kite tangled in tree branches. His face was streaked with dirt, and tears glistened in his eyes. Carl stood up and walked over, squatting down to meet the boy's gaze. "Need some help with that?" he asked gently. The boy nodded, sniffling. "I tried to fly it, but it got stuck." "No worries," Carl said, ruffling the boy's hair. "We'll get it down." Using a stick and some careful maneuvering, Carl managed to free the kite within minutes. The boy's face lit up instantly, his earlier sadness forgotten. "Thank you," he exclaimed, hugging the kite tightly. "You're welcome," Carl replied, watching as the boy ran off, his laughter echoing through the trees. Standing there, Carl realized how easy it was to make someone's day brighter. A kind word, a helping hand. It didn't take much, but the effects could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. Just like Keanu's words had inspired him, his actions might inspire others to pay it forward. Later that week, Carl finally returned home. The familiar driveway greeted him, lined with golden leaves that crunched underfoot. Linda, his wife, stepped outside, her arms crossed against the chill. She smiled warmly as he climbed out of the truck, pulling him into a tight hug. "Welcome back," she murmured. "Good to be home," Carl said, holding her close. For the first time in years, he truly meant it. Being away hadn't lost its sting entirely, but it felt less like a burden now. He carried a piece of himself, wherever he went, and that made coming home all the sweeter. That evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Carl shared stories from his trip. He told Linda about fixing Keanu Reeves's tire, the diner conversation, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. Her eyes widened when he mentioned Keanu, but she listened intently, nodding as he spoke. When he finished, she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "Not because of who you met, but because of who you are. You've always been kind, Carl. I think maybe you just needed a reminder of how much that matters." Carl squeezed her hand, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he needed to hear those words, not just from Keanu, but from someone who knew him best. In the weeks that followed, Carl continued his routine, hauling freight across state lines and navigating the challenges of life on the road. But something had shifted. He approached each day with a newfound appreciation for the connections he made, no matter how brief. Whether it was sharing a laugh with a waitress, offering directions to a lost traveler, or simply waving to another driver, he understood now that these moments mattered. They added up to something greater, a tapestry of kindness that stretched across highways and touched lives in ways both seen and unseen. One evening, as Carl settled into his bunk, he unfolded Keanu's signed photograph once more. The message beneath the autograph still resonated deeply. "Thank you for reminding me what kindness looks like." Smiling to himself, Carl tucked the photo back into its frame and turned off the light. He didn't need to keep it visible anymore. Its meaning was etched in his heart, a guiding principle that would stay with him for the rest of his days. Life on the road wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was rich with opportunities to connect, to inspire, to leave a mark. And Carl? He was ready to seize every single one. As sleep claimed him, Carl drifted off with a sense of peace, knowing that tomorrow, and every mile beyond, held endless possibilities.